In the early 20th century, the American Industrial Revolution increased manufacturing, causing a need to further boost profits by employing children at cheap wages. Child labor was detrimental to the children's education and health, as they were put in dangerous working conditions and could not attend school. To spread awareness of this situation, the National Child Labor Committee hired sociologist Louis Hine to communicate the violations of existing labor laws by photographing and writing reports of the exploitation of working children. Hine's photographs helped the public understand the child labor abuses occurring in industrial factories and the need for laws and reform. Louis Hine's revolutionary photographs caused Congress to enact national child labor legislation, including the Keating-owned Child Labor Act of 1916 and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. He proved the camera as a powerful social tool, influencing social photographers to expose social and economic injustices, which continues to influence legislation. The industrial period began in the early 19th century and was a phase of rapid standardization and industrialization, causing a need for a cheap labor force that could complete menial and repetitive tasks. This rapid economic growth led to the Gilded Age, which resulted in enormous wealth, especially for factory owners, and was juxtaposed with the poor working class. Muckraking journalists exposed structural problems, political corruption, and social hardships caused by these large businesses, mainly through political cartoons and literature. However, Louis Hine revolutionized muckraking journalism by utilizing the lens to communicate corrupt practices. His photographs had a greater impact on the American public because the provocative images humanized the issue more than writing or illustrated critiques and led to an understanding of the need for reform. In 1901, Louis Hine was hired to work as an educator and photographer at the Ethical Culture School in New York, and would go to Ellis Island and immigrant tenements where he exposed the poor living conditions of urban life. Profit-minded factory owners saw children as ideal employees since they could be put to work for lower wages and were less likely to protest against terrible working conditions. His work gained the attention of the National Child Labor Committee and Consumers League, who hired Hine to document working conditions in sweatshops in New York. His work was included in the Pittsburgh Survey, which served as the first full-scale statistical profile of an American industrial city. After this experience, Hine devoted himself to social photography and refined his own unique photographic style, which obscured the background, favoring the worker instead, and adjusted the camera to the subject's eye level, creating an emotional connection and communicating their story to the audience on a personal level. As a freelance photographer for the NCLC, Louis Hine carefully documented child exploitation with reports and photographs to provide a sociological evaluation of child labor. He created an iconography of what the American worker should not look like. His photographs communicated the unhealthy and dangerous environments that children worked in daily, where they were burned, lost limbs, and killed in gas explosions. This was in direct opposition to what the factory bosses rationalized, as they argued that children were providing an income to their household, that working conditions were not dangerous, and that if they were harmed, it was due to their low intelligence. Although Hine's critics claimed his photographs were not shocking enough, Hine argued that people would support the child labor campaign more if they felt the photographs were genuine and not exaggerated. Despite it being difficult to enter the factories, since bosses did not want anyone to witness the harsh practices and mistreatment of their workers, Hine was able to gain access by disguising himself as either an insurance agent or an industrial photographer who was promoting the machines in the factory. His photographs communicated the contrast of the small children and the industrial environment that was clearly not made for a child to work in. Often, his photographs were framed the same way with a different worker, conveying each child's experience was a part of a widespread issue. The children in Hine's photographs often looked weary, had dark circles under their eyes due to their 14-hour workdays, and appeared older than their age due to the health detriments with the dust and lint in the air.
It was unusual to graduate from high school in the years that we graduated. It's not like now. You go to school and you graduate, but back then if you could work, you worked, didn't you?
Hine unintentionally exposed the segregation between white and black children in the factory, because often the black children were located in a different part of the factory. As the NCLC's Director of Information, Hine attended meetings around the country and set up posters, photographs, and political cartoons to communicate the wrongs of child labor. At the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition, where the NCLC set up an educational display, Hine, as its publicity director and as an expert in adapting advertising techniques to his day, turned his photographs into powerful propaganda, stirring the public to action. During the Progressive Era, Hine's photographs, which he referred to as interpretive photograph and photo story, alerted the media, public, and legislators and allowed them to understand the need for regulation against child labor and placed an emphasis on education. Progressive era reformers, similar to Hine, led earnest campaigns that altered public opinion and raised awareness, and the goal of ending child labor seemed possible. These long and rigorous campaigns helped to spread doubt concerning the constitutionality of these practices. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act into law, which created legislation that restricted and regulated child labor, including prohibiting mines or factories that employed children from engaging in interstate commerce. During World War I, these progressive reforms were disregarded because of the need for workers to support the war effort, and the number of child workers soared. In 1918, the Supreme Court declared the 1916 Act unconstitutional and repealed it for overstepping federal regulatory authority. Shortly after President Franklin Roosevelt's 1933 agencies, dedicated to provide economic relief from the Great Depression, were developed, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was enforced. This provided the establishment of fair labor standards in employment and continues to guarantee labor rights to American workers regardless of age.
That will attempt to give to the industrial workers of the country a more fair wage return, to prevent cutthroat competition, to prevent unduly long hours for labor.
His impact on his field is evident in the style and message of other photographers' works, to raise a public understanding for social change, including American photographer Dorothea Lange, who used her camera to bring attention to segregation and communicate the extreme poverty of Americans following the Great Depression, which humanized the national crisis. Hine's revolutionary photographs inspired new forms of journalism, proved the camera as a powerful social tool, and influenced reforms. He became the inventor of social documentary photography to communicate social issues, and one of the first to provide a visual on not widely publicized problems. About 2 decades after his documentation of child labor, the term photojournalism was coined. Social photographers of the 1950s and 60s used the lens to document acts of racial discrimination and violence against the Black community in order to gain more support for the civil rights movement and ultimately influence legislation ensuring racial justice and equality. Hine's work influenced many modern photographers, including David L. Parker, who exposes alarming conditions and public health threats working children face internationally. He believes that capturing harsh circumstances can spur public opinion, and he cites Louis Hine as his influence. Today, modern fashion companies, including Gap, H&M, and Nike, still practice child labor in other countries. However, modern photographers like Parker communicate these social issues and make stride in regulating the use of child labor internationally through their photographs. Photojournalism is a unique method of journalism, and photojournalists communicate factual events that can lead to a greater understanding of a need for change. Today, modern photojournalism has shifted to giving an opportunity to anyone with a smartphone to document their world. Photographs have a more powerful effect on the viewer because a photograph can evoke a personal feeling that writing or illustrated mediums cannot recreate. Social photography continues the legacy of Hine as people recognize the power of the lens to communicate messages of equality and justice and to influence the public's understanding of social progress.